Garland, a research fellow at the Santa Fe Institute, and this is Mirta Galesic, a professor at the Santa Fe Institute. We're absolutely thrilled today to share with you some of our research we've been working on the last 2 years, studying the impact and dynamics of hate and counter-speech online that we've been working on with these three wonderful collaborators here on this slide.
Thank you, Joshua. According to the traditional definition of hate speech, it is any kind of insult, discrimination, or intimidation of individuals or groups solely because of their perceived political beliefs, religion, ethnicity, or gender. But more recently, definitions of hate speech have become broader, and this has been reflected in definitions of hate speech used by some prominent social media platforms. And now it is considered that hate speech is any kind of spreading of harmful stereotypes or prejudice about these groups. Let me give you an example. In Germany, a far-right group adopted a popular slogan usually used to promote diversity of German society. We are colorful, wir sind bunt. But they used it on a poster displaying pictures of battered, harassed, abused women, some of them of immigrant origin, many of them of German origin, suggesting that immigrants are actually engaging in harassing and intimidating women. In a more recent example in the US, a prominent far-right site has posted this news titled "Deported Rapists, 40 Migrants Apprehended in Texas Near Border." So as a casual reader might conclude that all of them were rapists. But even a very short read of the article suggests that actually there were only 2 among them who had past record of sexual abuse. So again, this kind of selective reporting and highlighting of certain facts spreads the prejudice and misinformation about certain groups. What is the prevalence of hate speech? Several recent studies have been looking at that, although we still don't have a good grasp on it, so we should take them with a grain of salt. But in one study that interviewed youth from 15 to 30 years of age in 4 different countries, have found that as many as half of that age group have been exposed to online hate. In another study, even more recent one, that interviewed kids, teenagers, 12 to 18 years of age in a number of different countries, have found a little bit lower prevalence for the US, 36%, but overall across different countries, the percentage ranges from 30s to almost 70%. So this is a widespread phenomenon. This last study also asked these youth whether they themselves engaged in spreading online hate. And actually from 4 to more than 30%, depending on the country, admitted that they themselves spread such material online. Or one interpretation is that large exposure to online hate actually shifts societal norms. And now teenagers might infer that it's okay, that it's one accepted way of achieving social status to spread online hate. There are consequences of that. This is not just speech. A study after Paris terrorist attacks have found that exposure to online hate increased perceived societal fear and uncertainty. And we know from intergroup theory of threat that when people perceive more threat to their group, they're also there is also a connection to a higher level of prejudice towards outgroups. As we've seen from the previous study, it could also lead to more hate speech because of shifting societal norms. And finally, some recent studies through some clever design are starting to show that online hate speech also has real-world consequences in terms of increased hate crime. What can we do about it? So one way to curb hate speech is through censoring. This has often been discussed. However, it has several problems. One is technical. So to detect hate speech, we need algorithms that are trained to detect them automatically. And the moment we train these algorithms to detect hate speech evolves. People find different other ways to express their animosity towards other groups. And so the algorithms become outdated. And so this is constant coevolution and race. The other problem is that banning hate from one side, such as in this study where certain Reddit channels were banned because of hate speech, this can merely shift hate to other platforms. But perhaps the most discussed problem is that it can be ethically problematic because of possible infringement of free speech. And of course, free speech is defined differently in different countries and even on different sides of political spectrum within a country. For example, in the United States, some would perceive this comment by Donald Trump as hate.
When Mexico sends its people, they're not sending their best. They're sending people that have lots of problems, and they're bringing those problems with us. They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists, and some, I assume, are good people.
So mentioning immigrants in the context of crime and rape. But others, on the other side of the political spectrum, would perceive this comment by Ilhan Omar as hateful.
Omar's speech to the Council on American-Islamic Relations, edited without the context of her remarks, which praised the group's support for Muslim American civil rights after 9/11.
Because they recognized that some people did something and that all of us were starting to lose access to our civil liberties.
Saying that some people did something on September 11. So as you can see, this is a very contentious issue. A promising alternative to censoring is counter-speech, and that's citizen-generated response to hate. It could be any kind of utterance or photograph or a video or a meme, anything that either attacks the perpetrator of hate speech or helps the victim in some way by supporting it, or just drowns out hate by, posting many pictures of puppies in a hateful discussion. And now I will hand to Joshua to tell us more about how we approach counter-speech in our study.
So the overarching question of our research, or kind of the million-dollar question we'd like to answer but we can't, is just flat out, is counter-speech an effective method for countering hatred online or curbing hatred online? And it's actually a very nuanced and very technical question when you start digging into it, primarily because of the word effective. And what does that mean? So one of the primary problems with trying to quantify this is causality. So if you say something is effective, then you're fundamentally saying that there's an effect caused by something else. And in order to prove causality, that's a very tall order, even for the most stringent of systems, but for human social dynamics, that's all but impossible. But let's say that we could show causality, then there's all sorts of other problems that we're going to run into, such as it's very difficult to automatically recognize counterspeech online. There's never been a large-scale corpora of counterspeech online, and there's been no longitudinal studies on the dynamics or impact that the two groups, hate speech and counterspeech, have with each other. So it's very hard to account for outside influences. There's not just one definition of effectiveness, so it's actually a very hard question to answer, surprisingly. But not all is lost. So fortunately, there's a current situation happening in Germany where we have a very active hate speech group, or a hate group, and we have a very active group opposing that group using counterspeech. And so one is called Reconquista Germanica, and one is called Reconquista Internet. So let's dig into a little bit about those two groups really quickly. So Reconquista Germanica was originally founded officially right before the 2017 elections, but there's a lot of evidence that they were actually active much before that, as early as January of 2016. They're very rigid. They have marching orders. They have a military-like structure, and their primary stated goal is to sway the election towards a particular alt-right party called the Alternative for Deutschland, or the AfD. Their other goal is to destroy public discourse. One thing that's really nice about this group, this particular hate group, is that they self-identify. And so in their bios, a lot of times they'll put markers such as these red X's or QFD or this parenthesis like emblem, which kind of shows, identifies them as being part of Reconquista Germanica. And while, maybe at first glance you want to say, well, this is just a group of people online trying to promote a particular political party, one thing to realize is that they're doing it very viciously. So these quotes come from a leak of their Discord channel in which they kind of show some of the tactics that they're using, right? And so it's like, attack young women, be offensive, troll people, basically do everything in your power to attack them. So they're promoting their message in a very vicious, hate-filled way. In January of 2017, Reconquista Germanica was formed, and their primary goal was to sway the German federal elections in 2017 towards the AfD. And so what you can see from this map is that between 2013 and 2017, there was a massive increase in the support for this party. So you could say that, like, okay, then they were successful. They went from, most states voting, 1% to 2% for this party to, in some states, especially in Saxony, where you're getting 30% of the vote. Perhaps as a result of Reconquista Germanica and their efforts to sort of destroy public discourse and to shift public discourse towards the alt-right and make anti-refugee discourse more acceptable, what you actually saw even in 2018 was these large alt-right Nazi rallies in Chemnitz where people were marching in the streets of Germany, doing Sieg Heils in front of police. And what's something really important to remember is that this is not so shocking in the US, but in Germany, doing a Sieg Heil is actually a felony. It's a crime that you can go to jail for. And these guys were felt so emboldened that they could actually do Sieg Heils in the streets. And currently on social media during this time, Ich bin ein Nazi was trending in German Twitter. But it's also really important to remember that this is not some societal vacuum. So at the same time, from 2015 on, there was a huge influx of migrants and refugees coming up from Syria, North Africa into Germany. And there's a lot of pushback in Germany at the time against this, saying that we don't need refugees, they're taking our jobs, they're violent. And it created a lot of different rallies where, for example, these Pegida rallies, where hundreds and thousands of people would join together and march against refugees and migrants. And so while there was a big effect and there was a big shift towards alt-right views, we can't in any way say that it's causally related to Reconquista Germanica because there was so many other things happening at the time. And so on the other side, to counter this and do the counter speech, was a group called Reconquista Internet. They were formed in May of 2018 with the express purpose of countering Reconquista Germanica. They were formed and encouraged by a German satirical comedian named Jan Böhmermann. He's very similar to John Oliver, if people are familiar with that show. And in one of his episodes, he called out saying that we need to stop them. We need to go out and we need to spread positive messages. We need to troll them. We need to stop these alt-right accounts. And so from this episode, Reconquista Internet was born with the idea of kind of bringing back a civil discourse through counter speech. And they also identified themselves. So we have a very nice collection of hate speech as well as a very well collection of counter speech. We can kind of use those two things together then to study this phenomenon over time. However, as we look at the changes in discourse dynamics, what we need to be very cognizant of is there's all sorts of different shifts in the German political spectrum at that time. So for example, there was massive rallies like Untelbar in Berlin and others where people were starting to get fed up with this alt-right propaganda and stand up against that. And so we have to be really careful about that and why causal inference is so challenging in this regard. Can we use the situation in Germany with a counter group and a hate group to kind of gain more insight into the potential for counter speech without directly measuring the causal effects? So to accomplish this and to study this question and hopefully gain some insight into this dynamics, what we did was we built a large-scale classification system, which I'll talk about shortly, to identify both hate and counter speech in real time. Something else that we did that no one else has done before is we built a large-scale longitudinal set of data, which allows us to look at political discourse as it evolved from 2015 to 2018. The first data that we obtained was approximately 9 million labeled instances of hate and counter speech. So this is a very, very large set if you're familiar with the literature. And the way that we did this was we took timelines of known members of RG and known members of RI. So we weren't just going out and saying like, oh, this is a right-wing account, we're gonna mark them as hateful. We're saying like, this is a hate account and we're gonna mark them as such. And this is a counter account and we're gonna mark them as such. And these accounts, the people that were participating in these two groups were primarily only participating in these two groups. And so we can say that the majority of their tweets during these times will be either hate speech or counter speech. This gives us a very large sample of data to train classifiers on to be able to recognize hate and counter speech or to learn domain-specific knowledge. The second thing we did, which really stood our group apart, is to study interaction dynamics. We collected more than 230,000 political conversations between 2015 and 2018 that grew in response to news outlets, journalists, and politicians. We need to take each tweet and map it to either it being counter or being hate. And in order for us to do that, we need to be able to represent the language that's being used in some mathematical context. We want to build some kind of mathematical representation of the language, which kind of captures the context and similarity between words. So if I say good or great, you know those are very similar, and they're very different than if I say fire truck. The way that we're going to accomplish that is something called a document embedding. I'm actually going to talk about a word embedding because it's a little bit simpler to explain, but it gives you the basic idea. And the step between a word embedding and a document embedding is just a very technical step that's very easy. So the way that a word embedding works is it's a neural net which is given the task of predicting the next word that's going to be said. So for example, if I said Guten, then is it more likely that I'm going to say Tag, Hoppenhof, etc.? And you do this over and over. And what's nice about this is that by the neural net learning how to predict the next word that you're going to say, it has to build up some kind of representation for what the language will be. And then what we can do is we can say, for example, Gutmensch, which is a very typical word used by the alt-right. We can pass it through our neural net, and then we can look up the feature vector, this vector that I have here. And then we can take that feature vector and we can map it down into space, some 300-dimensional object. And then what we can do is we can form what's called a hypothesis function or decision boundary, this black dotted line in this example, between counter speech and hate speech. We actually went one step above this though. Instead of having just one classifier where we classify text as hate or counter speech, we actually build what we call a panel of experts in a framework that's known as ensemble learning. So in this context, we have several experts that all have a slightly different understanding of the language. They also have slightly different tasks. For example, one may be predicting the next word you're going to say, but one other one's predicting 2 words from now, and things like that. So all the parameters are a little different, the training sets are a little different, and it gives them all a little bit slightly different view of the language. And we just ask them, each one of them, say, given this tweet, do you think it's hate speech or counter speech? And then they give us back confidence. They're 30% confidence hate speech, or they're 40% confidence counter speech. We ask all the experts on the panel to do this, and then we average all of their confidences together to give it a hate score. We then threshold this hate score and say that if all the experts are at least 70% confident, for example, or have a 70% threshold, then we'll mark it as hate speech. If all the experts are only 50% confident or less, then we'll just say it's neutral speech. So doing this actually gave us very good results. So for example, if we say that every expert has to be at least 95% confident to mark something as hate and counter speech, then on an out-of-sample data set, we actually achieved 97% accuracy. We want to make sure that the classifier actually represented human intuition. So we hired a bunch of mechanical Turkers, and we gave them different tweets, and we said, can you mark this as this is likely hate speech, this is likely counter speech, this is neutral speech, and that's what the graph on the right is. So this graph shows us that our classifier actually agrees very well with human intuition. Now we want to see how those things have evolved over time. We actually want to study how these things have interacted. And so to do that, what we did is we captured a bunch of conversations that grew in response to news organizations, politicians, journalists, these kind of things, as they occurred from 2015 to 2018. And we were actually able to capture several 100,000 of these conversations fully resolved. So everybody that replied, when they replied, what their account was, what they said, all these different things, and we can store those things. We can then replay the conversations as they're occurring in real time. And so for example, like this one on the bottom left, we see 2 different people arguing back and forth and going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And what's interesting is, like, now that we have this classification stage, can we then utilize that to see, is one of these a hate speech and one of these a counter speech, or is it just a girlfriend and a boyfriend arguing with each other, or what's going on here? And so we can start using our classification pipeline to study that. And the way that we do that is with reply tree coloring. And so these colored trees end up looking something like this, where white nodes are neutral text. This is just people talking. That does occur in these conversations. We don't in any way expect all text in these political conversations to be hate speech or counter speech. We expect to be lots of neutral speech.
Thank you, Joshua. So I'll be presenting results based on this wonderful classification system that my colleagues have developed. I should say that these results are preliminary and they have not yet been peer-reviewed. So take them with a grain of salt. As Joshua said, it is extremely difficult to answer the big question that we would really like to answer, and that's how effective is counter-speech in curbing hate. What we can do, though, is to develop several measures of interaction between counter and hate speech over time and try to discern on many levels their dynamics. And so we are doing this with a bunch of macro and micro level measures. On the macro level, we are simply studying the proportion of hate and counter speech over time. And on the micro level, we are then going more deeper in their dynamics and are looking at how much they're liked, how much each kind of speech, how much it is responded to, and then how effective is each kind of speech in steering the conversation towards one or the other type of speech. And first, let's look at this proportion of hate and counter speech over time. So on this graph, on the x-axis and horizontal axis, we have time from January 2015 to the end of 2018. And on the y-axis is proportion of hate and counter speech as identified by the classifier that Joshua has just described. On the top of the figure, you see markings of different societal events that happened during this period. And so we have events such as prominent political speeches, like a speech by Angela Merkel where she welcomed immigrants to Germany, or another speech early 2017 by a prominent right-wing politician who was having quite inflammatory speech addressing some of the right-wing ideas. And also some events also include some prominent terrorist attacks, such as Paris attack, Brussels attack, various terrorist attacks in Germany, and as well as political events such as elections in Germany in 2017, and near the end of the studied period, several large rallies, both alt-right and counter rallies that were going on at that time. So let's focus on the trends of hate speech and counter speech. We see that in spite of all of these societal events, the proportion of one and the other type of speech is quite stable over time. There are some blips. For example, after Islamic terrorist attacks in Paris and Brussels, we see an uptick in hate, but then rather quickly the proportion of hate falls back to a more steady state. Only after occurrence of Reconquista Internet, and this is the blue line near the end of this graph, we see a change in these trends, whereby counter speech now starts, the proportion of counter speech starts increasing and proportion of hate speech decreasing, and then they meet somewhere at a closer level than they were before. The emergence of Reconquista Germanica on this graph is shown by a vertical red line here more towards the middle at the beginning of 2017, and we don't see equivalent changes there. We see it after the occurrence of organized counter speech. We can still dwell deeper in the online discourse by looking at more finer measures of effect of interaction of hate and counter speech. One is the number of likes that each type of speech receives, and the other is the so-called subtree length, or basically the length of discussion that tweet of each kind, an average tweet of each kind provokes. And so we see that the number of likes is pretty similar for both hate and counter. It is around 5 to 6 likes throughout the studied period. And once Reconquista Germanica shows up, the blue vertical line, Reconquista Internet shows up, which is marked by a blue vertical line, then we see that actually hate starts receiving a little bit fewer likes than the counter speech. And then again, only after emergence of Reconquista Internet, which was marked by the blue line, we see that now the counter speech also starts receiving more discussion. Now we can go even deeper. We try to analyze how effective is each kind of speech in steering conversations towards one or the other type. And that's a rather complicated analysis, which I will first explain with this caricature example. So let's say that we are looking at this reply tree, which has been started by one of the news organizations whose Twitter accounts we were following. And so this is some news, maybe something about migrants, and it has been replied by several tweets. So, most of them are neutral, indicated by gray circles, and some maybe is counter, which is blue, and red, which is hate. And now the question we are asking is, say that a new tweet shows up, which is the red circle. What happens afterwards? Does the discussion after this tweet turns to be more hateful, or more counter-like, or more neutral? In other words, we're looking at this focal tweet, And then studying the discussion after it, average hate score of the tweets posted after it compared to the average hate score of the tweets posted before it. And we do it for each tweet in each of these 180,000 of reply trees. And this then results in something like this. So this heat map shows us how effective are different kinds of speech in steering the discussion one or the other way. First, on the x-axis, on the horizontal axis, again, we have time. It's the same time period from 2015 to 18. On the y-axis, now we have the hate score of the focal tweet. Each tweet, in turn, takes the role of the focal tweet. We record its score, and then we see whether the discussion after it became more hate-like, more counter-like, or more neutral. And this is denoted by the color of squares. The first thing to notice is that actually, very extreme speech is generally counterproductive. So if you look at the top of this heat map, I call it heat map, then those tweets that have the focal tweets that have the highest hate score are actually followed by discussion that's going more towards counter and neutral speech. Whereas tweets in the bottom that have high counter score are generally followed by discussion that's more hateful. So that's one overall observation on this data. But more to the topic of our interest is whether organized hate and counter speech changes things. It seems that it does. We see that there is a notable transition, a notable difference in the color of this heat map after occurrence of Reconquista Germanica. What happens is it seems that counter speech seems to be less effective than before. Now, after occurrence of hate tweets, the discussion is not so much steered towards counter and neutral speech as before, as indicated by a lighter blue shade of the squares after the occurrence of Reconquista Germanica. And this trend continues until the emergence of Reconquista Internet, where we now see that counter speech seems to become more effective. So we can go even deeper into the study of these dynamics by identifying the strategies that are used to steer these conversations. And we identify 4 such strategies. The first one is supporting. In this case, when a hateful or a counter tweet is posted in a discussion, it is followed by more hate or by more counter, respectively. So the focal tweet gets supported by the discussion that follows. In the opposing, the focal tweet gets opposed. And now, when a hate tweet is posted, it's followed by more counter speech, and vice versa if the counter tweet is posted. Then we can also think of polarizing, and that is when the discussion is initially quite neutral, but then over time it becomes more polarized overall towards hate or counter. And the final strategy is ignoring, where somebody posts a tweet and nobody cares. If you look at the trends in how often is supporting used to support hate or counter speech, we see that in general, hate speech gets more support than counter speech. Exceptions are some events such as the terrorist attack in Orlando, Florida, after which we see an outpour of support for counter speech. But otherwise, hate speech pretty much receives more support than counter speech. This changes a little bit after the emergence of Reconquista Internet, where we see that counter speech now starts receiving relatively more support than before. Another strategy is opposing. Here too, hate speech gets both more support, and we know that it was provoking more discussions from previous slides, but also on this slide we see that so throughout the period it provokes more opposition and counter speech. And actually, it could be that a very large covering of this new counter speech group, Reconquista Internet, in the media might have combined with large alt-right rallies happening at the time, has emboldened hate speech groups to attack the newly minted organized counter speech group. And then finally, let me say a few words about polarizing strategy. So this is when the neutral speech becomes shifted towards more hate or towards more counter speech. Interestingly, after occurrence of Reconquista Germanica, now we see a shift towards more polarization of neutral speech towards hate. And this might be one of the main ways in which Reconquista Germanica actually influenced public discourse, by shifting the whole speech towards more hateful speech. And then we see that after emergence of Reconquista Internet, the blue line, this at least temporarily shifts towards counter speech again. So this is the end of our results. As you can see, they are complex and multifaceted and hopefully paint a picture of this complicated interaction.
One of our major findings is that organization seems to matter. And so having an organized hate group or an organized counter group seems to shift public discourse. We have to take that with the caveats, though, that there's a lot of societal change, and Germany was really looking at itself through a new lens and doing a lot of self-reflection on what it wanted to be as a country. And so while it seems like these two groups made an impact, we need to be careful about concluding anything causal in this regard. Another interesting finding is that extreme speech seems to be counterproductive on either hate or counter speech. Both is met with the opposition, and while you provide hate speech into a conversation, it seems to shift the conversation back towards neutral or counter, and vice versa. If you're extremely counter speech, it also shifts the discourse back to either neutral or hatred. So while this is a very challenging question, it's a very hard question, there's a lot of caveats and things we have to look at. We think that this framework with a large-scale classification pipeline combined with many, many conversations over years is a really interesting test bed to start testing and understanding the dynamics that are occurring over time. Finally, I've often wondered if I had been around in 1933, is there something I could have done to stop what happened? It's becoming very apparent to me that if we don't figure out what's going on with our society right now, our children's children will have to ask the same question. What could I have done in 2020 to prevent what did happen in 2022? By providing citizens with effective strategies to counter the spread of hate online, our group hopes to contribute a small piece to the solution that our society must find before our problem gets to that point.
Good afternoon. My name is Duncan Watts. I'm a professor right here at the University of Pennsylvania, and we're filming on campus here at the university today. And I want to talk to you about a problem that I'm sure you've heard of many times and that you think you're familiar with, but I want to try to put that problem in context. And the problem is fake news, and the context is whether we should be so worried about fake news or more concerned about other sources of misinformation that we might find in the real news. So as you all know, ever since the 2016 election, and for some time before that, we here in America and other places around the world have been subjected to an epidemic of what we now call fake news. Now, this term has been used to mean a lot of different things, and I want to be clear at the beginning that I have a specific meaning for it, a specific definition, which is the definition that is generally used in the research community and typically also in the journalistic community. And that is information, deliberately engineered false information that is made to look and masquerade as real, legitimate news. Okay, so this is not news that you just don't like. This is not news from some partisan source that you think is biased. This is actually deliberate false information produced and engineered to look like it's coming from some kind of legitimate news source. So this term has become very popular since the 2016 election, and not just in general conversation. Almost 4,000 or over 3,700 English language research publications have been published since the beginning of 2017 with the phrase fake news in the title. This is an enormous number of papers to be published on any topic. And just to put that number in some context, before 2017, only 87 papers had ever been published with the phrase fake news in the title. So you can clearly see that there is a dramatic increase in interest in this term right around the turn of 2017. And just to put it in further context, if we look at all the articles published in that same period that refer to the phrase TV news or television news, that number is an order of magnitude smaller, only a few hundred. So fake news is something that the research community has become extremely invested in. Some of that interest has been driven by some very high-profile articles published by journalists and also by researchers. So you probably know about this one. In 2016, Craig Silverman at BuzzFeed published an analysis in which he looked at the 20 most shared fake news stories on Facebook and the 20 most shared real news stories on Facebook, and found that the fake ones outperformed the real ones significantly. There were several, almost 9 million interactions with fake news articles over the period that he considered. And this article really woke people up and got them focused on this problem. Since then, researchers have published results in high-profile journals like Science, where they found that falsehoods are diffusing further and faster on social media sites than things that are true. We find references to massive amounts of fake news and conspiratorial content in published research articles and even in the pages of the New York Times. So the conventional wisdom is certainly that fake news is an enormous problem. It's extremely prevalent. It's something that we should worry about. It's a threat to democracy. These are not exaggerations. These are literally what my colleagues and other people are saying on an everyday basis. But what I want to ask today is, how big is the problem in fact? And there's a couple of ways to quantify the scale of the problem. The first is the one that you've already seen, the one that shows up in mainstream media articles talking about, and also research articles talking about the problem of fake news. And this problem is what I call the numerator, or this part of the problem is what I call the numerator. So for example, a few years ago, there was a lot of attention paid to the number of fake ads that were purchased on Facebook, political ads purchased on Facebook by Russian operatives. And the number that was repeated over and over again was that 3,000 of these ads had appeared at a cost of about $100,000 in 2016. So these seem like big numbers. Also, those ads exposed almost 126 million users in 2016. That's a huge number. On Twitter, we find over 100,000 messages that have been labeled as false and generated by foreign operatives. Hundreds of thousands of YouTube views, and again, this figure from Craig Silverman's article about the 8.7 million shares, reactions, and comments on fake news articles. So these numbers seem like very big numbers. They are meant to seem like very big numbers, and that's how they're being interpreted. But what about the denominator? Let's look at some of the other numbers to put these numbers in context. If you think about what is 3,000 ads on Facebook and what is $100,000 in ad revenue? Well, Facebook made almost $9 billion per quarter in advertising revenue around that time. So that's $96 million a day. So $100,000 is a tiny, 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 infinitesimal fraction of advertising revenue on Facebook. The Russians, they exposed 126 million users. But in fact, given the vast number of posts on Facebook during that time, only 1 in 87,000 of them was in fact one of these posts. So you can do this exercise for all of these numbers. The number of messages on Twitter sounds like a big number, except it's less than 1% of election-related tweets during that period. On YouTube, there's over 5 million views per day of videos. So 309,000 is actually a very small number. And the same is true for this 8.7 million shares. It seems like a big number, but there's 2 billion people on Facebook. So if they're only doing a couple of things every day, then 8.7 million is a tiny percentage of overall activity. So we really do need to ask this question. Just because somebody tells you that, they have $1 million, is that a big number or a small number? And the same it's a big number compared to the average American. It's a very small number compared to Jeff Bezos, okay? So whenever somebody tells you a number, you always have to ask compared to what? And that's what we're going to do here, is put these numbers in context. There's a well-known adage or story in science about the drunk walking down the street. The man walking down the street at night, and he sees a drunk stumbling around under a street lamp looking for something. He says, "What are you looking for?" And the drunk says, "Oh, I'm looking for my keys." And the man says, "Did you drop them here?" And the drunk says, No, I dropped them over there by the door." And the man says, "Well, why aren't you looking for them over by the door?" And he says, "Well, I'm looking for them here because this is where the light is." And this is something that we tend to do in science, is rather than going and looking for the truth, which is what we think we're doing, we're looking where the light is. And we've been very focused on this question of fake news, and particularly on fake news spreading online via social media. But I want to put that problem in context in a couple of different ways. And the first is to say, well, fake news is certainly there. These numbers are not lies, they're true. But how big of a problem is fake news compared to all of the news? How much fake news do people consume in relation to how much news they consume? And secondly, how much fake news do they consume relative to all of the content that they consume? So that people don't just consume news, they consume all kinds of media, entertainment, sports, you name it. And so we really have to think about, as a percentage of everything that people are doing and reading and being exposed to, how much of it is really this fake news that we're so worried about. The second dimension I want to talk about is how are they getting it? So we're very, very focused on online sources, and I would say the reason for that, or there's maybe a couple of reasons, but one is that the data for online consumption is just easier to get. So when scientists try to do research, we look to see if we can get data, and the easiest data to collect is data for online production and consumption of information. But we shouldn't forget that television is still a huge factor in our lives. And as we'll see, if we want to talk about news, we really should be thinking about online and television. And so we have to ask, how big is this problem, both in relation to other types of information that people are consuming, and how big is it in relation to other mechanisms or other modes through which people get their news? Okay, so another way for us to look at this, or the big picture that I want to try to sort of push today, is that we want to evaluate this problem of fake news at the scale of the entire information ecosystem. And what I mean by this term, information ecosystem, is all of the information that's being produced by professional and professional news organizations, and also other people who are involved in producing news-like content, whether it's on the web, whether it's on TV, and potentially even on the radio. We also want to look at how it's being consumed. Just because somebody writes a story doesn't mean that anybody reads it. We know that some articles and some shows are interacted with a tremendous amount, and others not so much. So it matters not only what has been produced, but what has been consumed. And that's a different lens that we'll need to take. We also are very interested in how all of that is being absorbed. So just because somebody sees an article or reads an article doesn't mean they believe it, doesn't mean they change their opinion about anything. But so we ultimately are interested in this sort of pipeline, or this flow from production to consumption to absorption and eventually to action and engagement. So we want to understand, if we care about things like political polarization, and we care about declining trust in institutions, and we care about this sort of eroding basis of agreement about what is even a fact and what is reality, if we want to try to get to the answer to those questions, we have to look at all the ways in which people are getting information and how that is influencing their views about the world. So how are we going to do this? Now, we can't do all the things that I just said. That's an enormous project, and it's something that we're working on still. But for the purposes of presenting some results to you, I'm going to talk about some already quite large data sets that we've been able to collect. So we have two major sources of data. One is a national representative sample of TV consumption that comes from Nielsen, the ratings company. So this is the data that is used to price television commercials. You know, when publishers and advertisers come together in the early part of the year to set prices for things like the Super Bowl, this is the data, this is the engagement data that they rely on. So this is really sort of gold standard data about who and what sort of people are watching what kind of content on television. The second major source of data also comes from Nielsen, and this is the online equivalent. This is their desktop panel. It's a nationally representative panel of roughly 65,000 people, and everything that they are consuming online. So every single link that they go to is recorded, and we can see in very granular detail what people are consuming. We then complement that data set with a similar one that comes from ComScore, the other major ratings company, which includes both mobile and desktop consumption, because we know, of course, that an increasing amount of online activity is shifting over onto these mobile devices. So what do we do once we get this data? We have to make some definitions, and very quickly we define TV news consumption as the number of minutes per day per person devoted to watching any of roughly 400 programs that are classified by Nielsen as news. So this is this includes all the things that you would think of as news and probably a whole lot extra. So it's a very inclusive set of news programs. We then do a similar thing for online news content, where we rely on previous research that has identified more than 800 websites. This is, again, specific to the US, 800 websites that focus on hard news topics like politics, business, economics, and so on. For fake news consumption, again, we rely on previous research and work by academics and also journalists and fact checkers that have identified a collection of almost 100 websites that are produce either fake or deceptive or low quality or hyper-partisan news. So notice when I defined fake news at the beginning, I said, information that is deliberately false. We're being quite inclusive here and also adding sites that are not entirely lies, but are highly deceptive or extremely low quality or really, really hyper-partisan websites. So the definitions that I'm presenting to you here are actually sort of overestimates, both of the quantity of fake news that we're going to be measuring and also the quantity of news that we're going to be measuring. So if anything, the reality is somewhat less than what I'll tell you today. So here's the big picture, and I'm going to go into this in a little more detail with some more results, but all of it is really in this one slide here. And this shows everything that we find over a 36-month period, so 3 years of data here, putting together TV consumption and online consumption. And so I'll just walk you through this for a moment. So the blue colors refer to content that is not news related. So this is entertainment, this is gaming, this is everything, this is sports, this is celebrity gossip, this is social media, this is search, this is looking at how-to videos, all kinds of things that people do online and on television that is not specifically about news-related topics. The green colors all refer to news. So this is what we just defined, and we break things down by, in both cases, between television, mobile, and desktop. And so the three different colors of blue, 3 different colors of green, and then the red refers to the fake news content that I've just explained. And so already from this picture, you can see a few things. One is that people consume a lot of content. They consume over 7 hours a day of media, whether it's on TV or online. So we're not undercounting stuff. We are finding that people are watching and reading a lot of content on their mobile devices, on their desktops, and on television. And that number is pretty consistent over time. Okay, so the total amount of content that people are consuming is pretty consistent over time. The second thing that you can see very quickly from this picture is that the blue vastly outweighs the green. Okay, so people, by and large, are mostly not consuming news. And this is really important because I think those of us who work in this field as researchers or as journalists, we are news junkies. Like, we really spend an enormous amount of our time online in particular and in general consuming news. And we are extremely unrepresentative of the general population of this country. And so I think that's very important to keep in mind, that one of the problems I'll talk about is not that people are consuming the wrong news, it's that they're not consuming news at all. And that is indeed a big problem, and I think it's related to some of the problems that we care about around polarization and so on, but it's not the problem, it's not the same problem. It's not the problem of fake news. I want to keep that distinction clear. The second point to note is that the dark green bar, which is TV news, is much bigger than the light green bar, which is online news. So this is another point that I'll come back to and show in more detail, that if we want to talk about news in this country, really we should be talking about television, right? That online news, again, it's something that people in my world spend a lot of time consuming. I spend a lot of time on on reading news on Twitter. I spend a lot of time reading news online. But I also subscribe to the paper version of the New York Times and get home delivery. And who does that anymore? So I am an extremely bad representative or extremely bad sample of the overall U.S. population, and that shows up in our data as well. And finally, the red is there. You just can't really see it, right? So that is visually, the fake news is a tiny, tiny fraction of everything that's going on. So let's dive into these results in a little more detail. Well, before we do that, actually, one objection that you might already have thought of is this is an overall average for the entire population. But of course, we know that people of different age groups consume media and news in different ways. And in particular, we have the perception that younger people are much more savvy about online and much more on their mobile devices than older people. And they're also much less interested in news. So maybe we're going to find that these patterns reverse themselves for different age groups. And in fact, we do see some of the differences that correspond with conventional wisdom. Older people, in general, consume more content overall. They consume way more TV. They consume less online. And they consume a lot more news than younger people. Younger people, meanwhile, are much more devoted to online, to mobile consumption than desktop. They're more interested online than TV. And they're really not very interested in news at all. You can see those green bars are barely visible now. But the overall ranking is the same. It's the overall results from the first panel that non-news outranks TV news. Non-news outranks news. TV news outranks online news, and fake news is barely visible. All of those three results hold up, regardless of which age group and regardless of which time period we consider. So from this point on, we're going to mostly ignore age groups, and we're going to aggregate over time. So let's go to this first result, that non-news dominates news. And here we're splitting things out by online and television. So on the left, you see online. And here, the green bars, which are news, are again, barely visible, right? And we're being very inclusive here. We're including news that is encountered on social media. We're including news that is encountered by going to these news websites. And we're even counting news that is sort of encountered peripherally by going to major portal sites like MSN, Yahoo, and AOL, right? So even though there's a lot of non-news content on those sites, we're going to count every visit to those sites as being news. Again, to be as generous as possible to news consumption. And in spite of all of that, you can see that the blue vastly outweighs the green. And what are people doing? Well, they're going to social media, they're going to entertainment sites, they're going to search, they're going shopping, they're doing all kinds of things that we know people do online as soon as we think about it, but they're basically not looking at news. On TV, the picture is somewhat different. Here, news is actually the biggest single category of consumption on TV. So that's a very large difference. So news is important on television. But even so, it's still outranked by all of these other things put together. So if you add up drama and entertainment and sports, then collectively that is a lot bigger than news. But news on its own is a very important category. And both local and national news are important. And this is something else that I want to emphasize, because I think when we argue about TV news, we get very focused on the national cable channels like Fox and MSNBC and CNN, and a lot of action, a lot of consumption is local news. And this is really sort of the dark matter of the misinformation world, that we have very poor visibility there. We have very poor understanding of what's going on because it's very distributed. But it's a big source of information for Americans. Now on to the second result, which is that TV news dominates online news. So now let's just focus on news consumption. So we've already established that most consumption is not news, but let's say we only care about news consumption. Let's look at that. And fortunately, we have a subsection of the Nielsen television panel that is also included in the online panel. So for those 25,000 people, again, a representative sample of the US population, we can see at the individual level how much their TV consumption varies with their online consumption. And these results are quite striking, so I just want to walk you through them. The x-axis, the horizontal axis here, is mean desktop news consumption per day, and the vertical axis is mean television news consumption per day. And you can see that the left-hand bucket there for the x-axis, for the horizontal axis, is 0, right? So this is the number of people who consume 0 online news per day, right? And that's 44% of the population. So almost half the population does not look at news online at all, okay? Even worse, almost 3/4 of the population consumes less than 30 seconds a day of online news. And you might say, well, this is just desktop consumption. People are going to look at news on their mobile devices. And that's true, but according to our best estimates, the amount of news consumption on mobile devices is about the same as desktop. So if we double that number to account for mobile devices, it's still 75% of the population are consuming less than 1 minute of news per day online. This is a very small amount of exposure. Meanwhile, the consumption of TV news is more than 10 times that, right? That people are consuming at least 20 minutes a day and sometimes several hours a day. Okay, so TV news dominates online news. Overall, it's about 5-1. In the older category, it's about 8-1. And even, this is surprising, even among the youngest viewers in our panel, TV news is about twice as much. The consumption of TV news is about twice as much as online news. That was a result that surprised us. The third result is about fake news. So now let's just, again, focus on news and ask what percentage of the news that people consume is this fake news, this deliberately engineered false information made to look like real news. And again, this is the red bar. Now you can at least see the red bar because we've excluded all of the non-news related content. And again, you can see some things that are consistent with conventional wisdom, that older people are more likely to consume news, both online and on TV, than younger people. You can see that the biggest source of online news is just going to regular mainstream news sites. So, when we talk about people going online, they're not really being exposed to Russian operatives or bots on Twitter. They're mostly going to, the New York Times, CNN.com, Washington Post, The Guardian, all of the brand name sites that some of you probably write for. Those are the dominant source of news content online. So even though fake news is visible, it's a relatively small portion. It's only about 1% of overall news consumption online. Meanwhile, on TV, there really is no fake news. Now, you might say, that's not true. I think Fox is fake. Or you might say, I think CNN is fake. But neither of them are fake according to this definition of fake. They, as much as you may not like them, as much as you might think they're biased, as much as you might think they're slanted, they're not, deliberately producing outright false information and making it look like news. They're doing something that might be shady, and we'll get to that, but it's not fake news in this definition. So there's really no fake news on TV. Meanwhile, what there is a hell of a lot of is local news, national news, and cable news, right? So again, all the stuff that you know about, right? That's there, and that is a huge effect or a huge portion of people's media diets, and again, particularly older people. So what are we finding here? Again, three key findings. News is really a pretty small part, about 14% of overall media consumption. TV news dominates online news by a factor of 5 to 1, and fake news comprises less than 1 minute per person per day, which is less than 1/10 of 1% of total media consumption, and only about 1% even of news consumption. So what does that mean? What should we ask based on these questions? If online fake news is really so rare relative to everything else, is it really still a danger to democracy? Is that really the thing we should be focused on? Or should we broaden our scope of misinformation research to include everything else, including the real media? And what would that require? So I really want to advocate for this second option. It's certainly possible that even a small amount of exposure to fake news could have a big effect. You can tell a story about that. But we really should be evaluating that in terms of problems that exist elsewhere in this much larger fraction of the pie. So where should we be looking? And the point that I want to leave you with here is something that, it might be a little uncomfortable for you. You're all professional journalists, and, I very much appreciate, what journalists do. But I also appreciate what scientists do. I'm a scientist, and I realize that science has its problems, and we're grappling with those problems in what you might have heard of is called a credibility crisis or replication crisis. And I think that there are problems in the mainstream media as well, basically because there are many ways to mislead. There are many ways to bring a reader or a viewer to a false conclusion or a conclusion that is not supported by the evidence without lying, without saying anything that's false, without saying anything that would fail a fact check. And there's a lot of different ways to do this. The first one we've already seen. You can mislead with numbers. None of the numbers that I showed you earlier were false. They were all completely accurate as far as I can tell, but they are extremely misleading because they're meant to make you think that something is common when in fact it is not. A second way to mislead without saying anything that's inaccurate or false is by editorial emphasis. So in the 8 days before the 2016 election, between when James Comey announced that the FBI was reopening its investigation into Hillary Clinton's email server activities and the election itself, the New York Times published more front-page articles about Hillary Clinton and her emails than it had published about any of her policies or any policies of her and Donald Trump in the 3 months leading up to the election. 8 front-page articles. So this was 10 front-page articles in 8 days. So this was an extraordinary level of attention to this one particular story, which I think we can all agree now was probably not the most important story of the 2016 election. So just by emphasizing something, you can make people think that it's really important, and in this case, really bad and really damaging to a candidate's credibility, without saying anything that's wrong. It was real. It really happened. And people were upset about it. But just by writing about it over and over and over again, it blew it up into a much bigger problem than it could have been. Another way that you can mislead without saying anything incorrect yourself is by amplifying false or misleading things that other people say. So this is a really common problem in the media where the president says something on Twitter that is demonstrably false or is highly misleading, and everybody reports it. Right? So this is an example of Trump talking about the so-called crisis at the border, which was, if it was a crisis at all, was a completely manufactured one. Nevertheless, all the major networks carried this address live to the country, and they did not carry every president's major addresses. So this is not something that they were obligated to do, but it's something that they chose to do, and those choices have consequences. Another way to mislead without lying or saying anything that is, strictly speaking, false is by cherry-picking data. So this is a very nice example, an article in the Washington Post that claimed to find the share of men under 30 who aren't having sex has nearly tripled in the past decade. This sounds like a big deal. This sounds like a major trend. But it turns out, if you reanalyze the very same data that was presented in the Washington Post article, that result only came from the very end of the data, the last decade. And as Simon Dedeo, a professor at Carnegie Mellon University, showed very simply, there were at least 3 stories that you could have written with exactly that data that would have been just as accurate and just as correct, that had very, very different interpretations. So one is the one that was written, the stunning increase in the last decade. A second one would have been to look at the decade before that and note that prior to this rise, levels of sex, roughly the fraction of men not having sex dropped by a factor of 2. Right? So you could have told, in fact, the opposite story, that in the 1990s, more men were having sex. And finally, if you looked at all the data and just did a simple regression through everything over the entire time period, you would find nothing changed at all. That on average, the level of sex was roughly the same as in the 1990s. And that's probably the most accurate, least misleading analysis of this data, is to say basically nothing really changed. But that's a boring story. Nobody wants to write that. And so you cherry pick the data that has the most exciting interpretation, and that's what everybody hears. Okay? And that's not obviously correct. Yet another way to mislead people is by slapping a misleading headline on an otherwise accurate article. So this is a particularly striking case where the headline says that smart people are more likely to believe fake news. In fact, the research that this article was reporting, and this, by the way, is The Guardian, right? So this is a highly reputed newspaper. The research that the article was reporting actually found the opposite result, that people who score highly on a cognitive reflection test, the so-called smart people, are actually less likely to believe fake news than other people. And in fact, the article got that right. So if you read through the entire article, you would have found the article itself contradicted the headline. But we know that not everybody reads the entire article. And in fact, probably most people do not read the entire article. However, everybody sees the headline. So if you put something wrong in the headline, that alone can have real impact, can really mislead people, even if the article itself is correct. And finally, and sort of least transparently and perhaps most importantly, the media can influence what people know and what people believe simply through determining what they talk about. And so, Rupert Murdoch is a scary figure. He's somebody who has spent decades acquiring power in the media in order to set the agenda. And he's quite explicit about that. He has a very conservative agenda, and he wants his newspapers and his outlets to promote that. And so this is something that other people in the media are certainly worried about, but this is a problem for all of the media. This is a problem that what the media decides to talk about and what the media decides not to talk about can have a real influence on the conversation, on the things that are considered to be of interest, and that can have as much or even more influence over what people believe and understand as how that information is presented. So what are we supposed to do about this? I mean, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. These are really big challenges. They are thorny questions. Answering them is extremely difficult. Even just assembling the data that I showed you, which is a tiny portion of what we really need, was a major challenge and took a couple of years. Once we start trying to, ask questions about, whether an article is accurate, whether it's biased, whether it has a particular slant against a candidate or in favor of a candidate, these are questions that are right at the cutting edge of machine learning and natural language processing. And some of my colleagues here at Penn are actively and around the country are actively working on these hard technical challenges. But we are, really, we have not solved them. So these are very much open research questions. And even if we can solve the technical challenges, there are also really conceptual challenges. I mean, you might, we often talk about facts and the truth as if we know what we mean. But I assure you, once you start looking at the data, it becomes very murky. It becomes much less clear. If you say, okay, what's the first fact in this article? That seems like, of course, you can answer that question. It turns out it's not so easy to answer it. If you wanted to say, how accurate is this article? It turns out that's a really hard question to answer because it's not even clear what you mean by that. So we have technical challenges, we have conceptual challenges, and we certainly have enormous practical challenges in terms of acquiring and cleaning and processing vast amounts of data. Fixing them is going to be even harder, right? Even once we know what the problems are, fixing them could require changes not just to technology platforms, which is something we hear a lot about, but also to institutional norms. How should journalists cover the news? How should journalists talk about Donald Trump? How should editors make decisions about what to cover? What effect are you having as a news organization? I think that people who work in the media often perceive themselves as being sort of objective bystanders, and they're just telling us things that are happening. But they're not just doing that. They're also telling us, they're also having an influence on what is happening. They are part of the game, and they are influencing what people understand and what people know about. And these are important responsibilities that I think can sort of be pushed aside, but should not be pushed aside. So we have a lot of challenges in answering questions, a lot of challenges in fixing them. But I think one thing I do feel confident about is that we're not going to make any progress on any of this unless we have really accurate and comprehensive data that allows us to map out the production and consumption and effect of information and how all of this translates to the larger problems that we care about in democracy. Thank you.